What's up, everyone? What if I were to tell you that one of the best ways that you can improve your jazz articulation and feel is by working out of the Rochut Etude book? You might expect me to ask you to play something like this. Now, I hope you know me better than that and don't think that's actually what I was expecting. But in today's lesson, we're going to cover how the concepts that we deal with when we're practicing Bordoni etudes set a strong foundation of air, sound, and articulation that we can transfer over to our playing as jazz trombone players. All right, for today's lesson, you're going to see me switch hitting between these two instruments. Now, I'm not someone who necessarily thinks you have to play jazz on a small horn, you have to play classical music on a big horn. However, it can be a useful way to help compartmentalize our sound as we switch between these two sort of concepts of sound. To start with, I'm going to play a little bit from Rochut, so I'm going to start on the big horn. All right, that was a little bit from Rochut number 7, just to sort of set a baseline of what we're talking about. Now, just to compare that, let's listen to a couple A sections of rhythm changes. Now, this is a solo I actually wrote out because there are a few key concepts that I want to focus on for today's lesson, but when I wrote it, I was really just improvising. I just wanted to make sure I was able to fit all the concepts into these short 2A sections, so let's check that out. All right, now that we've heard our two examples, we want to think, how are these elements connected, and how can practicing Rochut help us as jazz trombone players? Clearly, there are going to be many stylistic differences and things of that nature, and potentially the sound concept might be slightly different as we're going between these two styles. However, there are certain key concepts that we can sort of focus on that are going to be universal for us as trombone players. The first one of these concepts, and one of the key things that we focus on when we practice the Bordoni etudes, is trying to establish a consistent airflow, which is going to lead to consistent sound and consistent response. I cannot think of a concept that is more important for us as brass players, regardless of style, than this one. And even when we're going to play in a jazz setting or an improvised setting where we have a much wider variety of articulations that are commonplace and expected, we still want to start from a baseline of an even airflow and a consistent sound. So that way, when we go to add the different articulations we use, whether it be short articulations, maybe a little more biting articulations, ghosted notes, those things really pop. If our sound and our air and our response is uneven to begin with, and we don't have that strong foundation, when we go to actually play jazz and play these fast-moving syncopated eighth note lines where we want different articulations, it's just not going to land. It's just going to sound uneven. To illustrate this, let's check out the first A section of this composed solo that I play as the example. I'm going to play it just a little bit slower so that we can really hear articulation. And my goal is to think that all my eighth note lines in particular are very, very even, exactly the same as if I was playing one of the Bordoni etudes, where I'm really striving for even response. So that way, any place I want to change, have a little shorter note, have a ghosted note, have a more accented note, it's really going to pop to the foreground, and the swing is really going to happen. If you have any questions about, like, how do we make swing happen, how does articulation play into how swing occurs for us as players, I encourage you to check out some of the past lessons that I posted. I've done a couple lessons on this that you can find in the channel that will hopefully be instructive. The articulation is just as important as our swung eighth notes. So let's check out this example, and hopefully we'll hear some of this there. All right, right, that covers concept number 1, evenness of air and thus evenness of sound. The next thing we want to talk about is kind of one of the other big things we practice when we practice Rochut, and that is playing legato. In mid-2020, I produced a series of online clinics, kind of master classes for all the different instruments that would be in the jazz band for one of the nonprofits that I work for. And one of my colleagues, Andrew Janik, great saxophone player, during the clinic that he was recording, he said a line that I just thought really summed up jazz in a nutshell. This line was, "Jazz is a legato music." Now, I don't know about you, but I've surely known that for a long time. However, him just summing it up so concisely, I'm sure I was in the background of that little video recording session being like, yeah, like he had just played a killing lick at a jam session or something like that, because it was so succinct and so on point. And so we really want to connect to this fact. Jazz is generally a legato music, especially when we're playing eighth note lines. Again, it's the consistency of our eighth note lines that makes all the syncopated things pop so much. And so we want to practice our legato style in a very confined and objective space like a Rochut etude. Now, when we play Rochut, we tend to use a mixture of natural slurs and legato tongues. Now, if natural slurs are something that you're not familiar with, if you're a practicing trombone player, you probably are, but just to go over it very quickly, let's look at a little example. Now, I'm right at the very beginning of Rochut number 7, and what I've done in this example, I've put brackets underneath the notes that are natural slurs or partial changes. So those notes, I would not necessarily have to tongue if I didn't want to. I could just let the partial change make the notes speak for me. Now, this approach allows us to achieve our most legato sound possible, if we can control it. It can be challenging to get all of these natural slurs to speak really cleanly, and that's one of the things we all need to practice when we're working on Rochut. Now, when we transfer this over to our jazz playing, I actually tend to favor the legato tongue, the do or the lu syllable, where that tongue just flicks very momentarily into the airstream, as my main articulation. There are surely times where I use a natural slur, but I really love the clarity and the rhythmic pulse and control over the articulation that using that legato tongue gives me. Now, you could certainly find players, like Carl Fontana comes to mind, or somebody like Conrad Herwig, who use a lot more natural slurs in their playing, and that's fine. It's just different tastes for different players. However, for my students working, I really love for them to be able to play an entire Rochut etude with a legato tongue, make it sound pretty legato, and then add the natural slurs. Not only are the natural slurs a little more challenging for many students, but we really need to be able to do both. And we need to be able to control both well, whether we're playing Rochut or whether we're playing in a jazz context. All right, our third concept that I know I practice when I'm working on Rochut, and I make sure that my students are practicing, is working on phrasing. This element of these etudes is a really important one because the book does not have a ton of dynamics written in it. A few things, but it's really up to us, the musician, to bring these etudes to life. This is one of the reasons why we work out of this set of etudes, is because it's a great way to learn how to interpret these sort of straightforward European classical melodies. To do so, we're going to use just sort of our general good guidelines of how we add dynamics. We're going to follow the line. As the line goes up, we tend to get a little louder. As it goes down, we tend to get a little softer. We might look at the phrasing. Is it a 2-bar phrase, a 4-bar phrase, and adjust our dynamic shape accordingly. I know I'm also always telling my students to not be too predictable with this. So every time the line goes up and down, you don't want to follow that. You want to do that probably 75 to 90% of the time, but then sometimes you need to do something different to maintain the listener's interest. These guidelines work great when we're playing jazz lines as well. For the most part, I'm probably not going to think about it ahead of time in the same way I would when I'm working on a Rochut. It's going to just occur naturally based on the listening that I've done, but the same thing applies and is going to make your improvised lines sound more authentic and like they have more life than they're just all monotone. Let's check this out in an example. All right, to start with, here are the first 3 phrases of Rochut number 7, and I've actually gone ahead and written in the dynamics beneath them. I chose to use 2 2-bar phrases and then 1 4-bar phrase. You actually could play the first 4 measures as a 4-bar phrase as well. I think that sounds nice also, but here I chose to do 2 2-bar phrases and a 4-bar phrase. Let's hear what that sounds like. All right, now switching back to our jazz example, I'm going to play the first A section of that solo that I wrote, And I'm going to think about these same sort of dynamic gestures. If we look at the musical example, we can see as my line sort of generally ascends through those first two bars, I'm going to crescendo through that. It's going to sort of peak around the end of the second bar of the form and then sort of follows that line downward, then a little bit back up, and then just generally follows that line shape. These gestures, aside from that first one, are going to be a little more subtle than they are in Rochut, but they are still definitely there, and that is what gives this line some life and makes it feel like a melody rather than just that I'm like playing the changes. Looking for ways to add dynamic life and shape to your lines, whether you're improvising or playing a written part in a jazz context, I think is incredibly important. We get so focused on note choice when we're working as improvisers. Am I playing this hip lick? Am I inside the chord? Whatever. We sometimes ignore sound, feel, dynamics. These things are what really the audience is probably keying in more on. You know, maybe some people care about, oh man, this guy just played this hip alter dominant lick on this 5 chord. Most people don't care about that. Maybe a few do, but most people really don't. They just want to be moved by the music. And if your lines and your improvised solos have a lot more dynamic shape to them, they're going to be much more interesting to listen to. All right, our final element that we can carry over from practicing Bordoni over to playing as a jazz musician is the importance of ornamentation. Now, I would argue that a lot of the jazz that we really love, especially from the 1940s and 1950s, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Clifford Brown, they are playing essentially highly ornamented styles. And so learning how to deal with ornamentation and make sure that it all feels good and doesn't feel cumbersome, but just feels, again, like an ornament, something extra that makes the music more interesting is what we want to focus on. Almost all of the Bordoni etudes have some amount of grace notes in them. And depending on what edition of the book you have, they might be slightly different, but this is pretty common through all of them. And learning how to manipulate these grace notes so that they happen in a smooth fashion and they don't disrupt the overall rhythmic feel of the piece is important. I do know some players like to play these with a little more flowing sense of time. However, I really like to practice them relatively in time, except for the few places where there's maybe retard marked, or sometimes at the end of the phrase, it might be nice to have a little bit of a slowdown. I generally like them to be pretty in time. And when we encounter grace notes, we need to make sure that same thing happens. Let's look at an example. This is a little ways further down the etude from where we stopped. We start on an F. We're kind of transitioning from a B flat major section and kind of to a G minor section. This has a couple of grace notes that occur inside of an eighth note line where they can be a little tricky to make sure they land right in time. Let's listen to this. Okay, cool. Hopefully I did a good job of keeping those grace notes nice and light and in time. Remember, they're an ornament. They're extra. They are not the main melody, so we don't want them to disrupt the main melody. Let's look at this in a jazz context. Now, I played a couple of ornaments in the example solo I played in the form of turns, embouchure turns. You know, I'm using my face to go da-li-yat, to get that little turn figure that saxophone players or trumpet players often play that sometimes on trombone can be a little cumbersome, and we got to figure out another way to make that happen. So let's give this a listen and see again if I was able to incorporate these in a sort of rhythmically smooth fashion. This style of ornamenting and kind of taking the language of bebop and making it work on trombone is what I feel like J.J. Johnson was so great at. These embouchure turns, he just plays them so clean and so in the pocket. And for me, that's what I really want to strive for when I'm adding ornamentation to my lines. All right, so there we have it. That is some of my thoughts about why Rochut is such an important foundational book. Now, most of us as low brass players know this, but it's also great to think about how it can really impact us as jazz trombone players. Not just when I'm, trying to develop a good foundation for my classical playing, but when I really want to think about, is my jazz articulation really what it should be? I'll leave you with one final thing to think about. The legato nature of Rochut is one of the most important things to key in on about this lesson. So often when I hear inexperienced jazz musicians, either people who don't play jazz a lot or younger students trying to play jazz, they make their eighth notes sound like this. Now, maybe that was a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but the sort of separated nature of those eighth notes and also the sort of like overswung nature of them where we have ta, 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 is something I hear very commonly when I go out and work with middle school and high school big bands. So helping students understand how, again, jazz is a legato music, and it's all those smooth, connected, relatively even eighth notes that are going to make all the other things really swing and feel good is what we need to focus on, whether we're practicing out of Rochut or just practicing trying to get better with some other device. All right, we'll see all of you in the woodshed.